Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I declare open agenda item 3, entitled Promotion and Protection of All Human Rights, Civil, Political, Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, including the right to development. Before we start, I wish to recall that pursuant to the President's statement adopted last December, one-page summaries of the reports of the Special Procedures mandate holders have been made available on the extranet under the heading Reports of the Special Procedures, Quick Overview. I encourage delegations to have a look at these summaries when preparing to participate in relevant interactive dialogues. We shall now begin the interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. It is my pleasure now to welcome to the podium Mr. Niels Melzer to present his reports. Sir. Sir, welcome. You can start your presentation. I thank you.
Mr. Chair, distinguished representatives, observers, ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to briefly update you on the main activities of my mandate. On 15th of October, I presented my interim report to the General Assembly on the relevance of the prohibition of torture and ill treatment to the context of domestic violence. Throughout 2019, my mandate transmitted 114 communications on behalf of individuals exposed to torture and ill treatment. This is only a small percentage of the requests received by my office, but unfortunately the limited resources at my disposal severely restrict the number of cases which can be addressed. In this context, I wish to sincerely thank the Government of Switzerland for its generous support to my mandate. The Government of Norway, however, has asked the High Commissioner's Office to return approximately $100,000 that had been donated as earmarked funds to my mandate in 2017. To my great regret, this unprecedented measure has deprived my mandate of its research budget and has caused significant delays in my thematic work, which is one of the reasons for which my current report is submitted late, for which I apologize. Given the increasingly restrained resources and the constantly growing demand, I must appeal to this Council for additional contributions and resources that would allow my mandate to better respond to the needs of its beneficiaries. Mr. Chair, from 9th to the 10th of May last year, together with two experienced medical experts specialized in the examination of victims of torture, I conducted a visit to Mr. Assange, detained at Belmarsh Prison in London, as well as meetings with relevant British authorities in order to assess Mr. Assange's state of health and conditions of detention, as well as alleged risks of torture and ill treatment arising in relation to a possible extradition to the United States. Our conclusions were that, over the years, Mr. Assange had been exposed to various forms of cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment which cumulatively amounted to psychological torture. Despite my urgent appeals and follow-up letters to each of the involved states, the United Kingdom, United States, Sweden and Ecuador, no measures of investigation or redress have been taken, and none of the concerned governments was prepared to adequately respond to the questions, allegations and concerns transmitted to them, or to otherwise enter in a constructive dialogue with my mandate. I must stress that, as a general point, when states consistently refuse to cooperate with the international mechanisms they have created for the monitoring of their compliance with the human rights standards they have committed to, I am seriously alarmed as to the continued credibility and functionality of the global human rights system. I have therefore chosen to more proactively raise these issues in the public sphere and to draw attention to the related systemic risks for the provision of torture and ill treatment and for the international rule of law more generally. From 12 to 15 June 2019, I conducted a country visit to the Comoros. Regrettably, I had to suspend my visit halfway through as full access was obstructed to places of detention, and despite an ad hoc high-level meeting at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it was impossible to obtain compliance with the terms of reference of my mandate. Nevertheless, due to the urgent need for reforms and investment, I decided to submit a full visit report to this Council, which is an addendum to this thematic report. The information collected during the visit supports my findings that the conditions of detention generally amount to ill treatment, and there were also credible indicators of torture and ill treatment in the context of policing during demonstrations and upon arrest and interrogation. I'll be happy to respond to questions on this in the dialogue. From 17th to 24th of November, I conducted then a country visit to the Maldives. The visit was conducted in accordance with the terms of reference of my mandate, and I have issued extensive preliminary observations after the visit, which I will not repeat here, but in principle the Maldives is equipped with the necessary legal, structural and procedural framework and a suitable political environment also to prevent torture and ill treatment. In my view, the biggest challenges faced by the Maldives are over-incarceration, conditions of detention and impunity. I am delighted to report, however, that shortly after my visit, the government implemented my recommendation and declared on the 26th of December its recognition of the competence of the Committee Against Torture to receive individual communications in accordance with Article 22 of the Convention. The government has also invited my mandate to conduct a follow-up visit before I present my final report to the Human Rights Council in March next year. With regard to country visits, more generally, it is important to note that my mandate has endeavoured to engage with a number of states to undertake country visits, including those that have issued standing invitations to special procedures. However, despite repeated requests to China, Egypt, India, Philippines, Russia, South Africa, the United States, just to name a few, these states have not yet invited my mandate to conduct an objective assessment. I therefore encourage these and other states to engage constructively with my mandate. So, Chair, on my thematic report this year examines conceptual, definitional and interpretative questions arising in relation to the notion of psychological torture under human rights law. My mandate has long recognized psychological or mental torture as an analytical concept distinct from physical torture. It has addressed specific methods or contexts of psychological torture. It has pointed to specific challenges arising in the connection with the investigation and redress of this type of abuse, as well as to the inextricable link between psychological torture and coercive interrogation. The mandate has also dedicated a full thematic report to the practice of solitary confinement, has advocated the development of guidelines on non-coercive interviewing, has supported the update of the so-called Istanbul Protocol on the investigation and documentation of torture and ill treatment, and has raised awareness for the challenges of psychological torture in numerous individual communications. Although all of these initiatives have generally been well received by states, national practice still tends to deny, neglect, misinterpret or trivialize psychological torture as what could euphemistically be described as torture light, whereas real torture is still predominantly understood to require the infliction of physical pain or suffering. Overall, the use of terms psychological torture in jurisprudence and human rights advocacy remains fragmented, and both legal and medical experts have long called for its clarification. In light of these considerations, my present report examines the predominant conceptual discrepancies arising in relation to the notion of psychological torture. It proposes working definitions of psychological and physical torture. It offers recommendations regarding the interpretation of the constitutive elements of torture in this context. It proposes a non-exhaustive, needs-based analytical framework facilitating the identification of specific methods, techniques or circumstances that amount to psychological torture. It illustrates how various combinations of methods, techniques and circumstances, not all of which would amount to torture if taken in isolation, how they can together cumulatively form torturous environments violating the prohibition. And it encourages the interpretation of the prohibition of torture in line with contemporary possibilities and challenges arising from emerging technologies and explores, in a preliminary manner, the possibility of basic contours of what could be described as cybertorture. Mr. Chair, I think I will close here, and I will go in more detail then in the questions and answers. Many thanks.
Thank you very much for your opening statement. And now, according to our practice, we shall start by hearing the delegation of the country concerned. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Comoros. You have 5 minutes. Please.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Vice President. The Union of the Comoros takes note of the Special Rapporteur's report on torture and other cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment during his mission to the Comoros between 12th and 15th of June 2019. It's an honor for us to make the following comments on that. The procedure under which this was organized is of itself major progress when it comes to addressing these issues in our country. It's very important to underscore on this occasion that addressing all these issues regarding human rights is fairly recent. It only started becoming a true concern and a concern of interest and of national importance as of the participation of our country in the second GPR in 2014. It is within that framework of the addressing of human rights issues that we need to understand the decision taken by the Comoros government to provide free access to all special procedures. The commitment being to create the best possible environment for the smooth operating of these missions. This is a clear expression of the will of the national authorities to make human rights a constant concern, ensuring ongoing dialogue with the Human Rights Council and OHCHR through missions and special procedures. That's the framework. As regards the problems detected by the Special Rapporteur during his mission, these can be explained by the following reasons. First of all, the awareness of the importance of these human rights issues is very real and pressing as regards the centralized state. However, it is not yet the case at the level of regional and local administrations. Hence, the rapporteur has not always found at that level the spirit of cooperation to which he was entitled. Secondly, a lack of understanding and lack of cooperation with some local bodies can also be explained by the fact that there was a lack of information that should have been provided by the central administration and given out to the regional and local authorities prior to and upstream from the mission. That is something that I think has been perfectly understood and mentioned in the report. It is also worth pointing out that this shortcoming in information was due to a religious and political schedule which was not particularly favourable to the smooth operating of this mission. The 2 months preceding the organisation of the mission were taken up successively by presidential elections and then the month of Ramadan, periods during which this work on providing information was not carried out as it could have been. Given this, in no case was there any instance of a manifest desire on the part of the state authorities to harm in any way the smooth conduct of the mission. The Special Rapporteur has taken note of that. As regards the content of the report, it is basically devoted to the prison system and the very poor conditions of detention. This is a real situation. It is equally of concern to our authorities, and that was mentioned during the most recent UPR of our country, January last. Ongoing steps are being taken also with EU partners to try to get a rapid solution to this very pressing issue. We believe that this deliberate focus of the report on the prison system also means that there are not really other serious situations, pressing situations, although the legal system is subject to some dysfunctioning, mainly due to insufficient human and material resources. We'd like to thank the Special Rapporteur for his many and relevant recommendations, and we certainly commit ourselves to make the best use of them with the help of our partners who are ready to support us. To conclude, the permanent mission of the Union of the Comoros would urge the withdrawal from the report of this mention Mayotte, which is the French Overseas Department. This is in Chapter D, Point 4, on nations in transit. Many thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. I would like to inform you now that the list of speakers is now closed. I now invite interested delegations to ask questions to the Special Rapporteur and to make comments on his reports. I would like to remind to all countries that speaking time is 1 minute and 30 seconds for members and observers. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Burkina Faso on behalf of the African Group. You have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. It's an honor for me to make this statement on behalf of the African Group. The African Group would like to thank the Special Rapporteur on torture and other cruel, inhuman, degraded treatment. Thank you for your report, which focuses on psychological torture. We share your view to the effect that psychological torture needs to be interpreted as including all methods, techniques, circumstances which aim to or are designed to deliberately inflict serious mental suffering or harm without actually using the effect of harm or physical suffering. We believe that torture in all its forms is a serious violation of human rights. Psychological torture is sometimes deemed to be clean torture, to normalize the act of torture so that it's accepted by the public. However, this form of torture destroys its victims as effectively as physical torture and must be prohibited and sanctioned. National human rights institutions and independent mechanisms play a key role in consciousness raising as regards this torture technique, which has become an absolute devastating phenomenon. To conclude, the African Group would like to recall that, as with other international and regional human rights instruments, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights enshrines the absolute prohibition of torture in Article 5. Thank you.
I thank you. Now I would like to give the floor to Pakistan on behalf of Organization of Islamic Cooperation. You have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. On behalf of the OIC, we thank the Special Rapporteur for his detailed presentation. We have taken note of the report and would closely study its contents from a legal perspective. Mr. President, upholding and advancing respect for human dignity and liberty is the ultimate goal of the global human rights agenda. Likewise, it is the raison d'etre and key objective of Islam. The abominable practice of torture and cruel and inhumane and degrading treatment is contrary to international human rights law. The OIC unequivocally condemns all forms and manifestations of torture and remains fully committed to preventing and combating this menace. Mr. President, OIC is gravely concerned about the systematic use of psychological torture as a tool of oppression against people living under the yoke of foreign occupation and striving for one of their fundamental rights, that is, the right to self-determination. We are also dismayed over growing incidents of psychological torture being meted out to migrants and refugees, ostensibly for security reasons. Furthermore, OIC urges that, propelled by new fascist regimes, the sharp rise in intolerance, discrimination, negative stereotyping and violence against people on the basis of religion or belief, race, ethnicity must also be seen through the prism of psychological torture. We would welcome the Rapporteur's views about these troubling global trends related to psychological torture and the role of the UN human rights machinery in halting these serious human rights abuses. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to distinguished representative of European Union. You have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The EU is pleased to engage with the Special Rapporteur. Mr. Meltzer, we share your commitment to the universal and absolute prohibition against torture and any other forms of cruel, inhumane or degrading treatment or punishment, and we welcome your active contribution to the fight against torture. The EU remains committed to combating all forms of torture and ill treatment. The EU pays particular attention to victims of torture and ill treatment and calls upon all states to fully investigate all alleged cases of torture in order to ensure accountability. Last year, the EU revised its guidelines on the EU policy towards third parties on torture. Torture is one of the gravest attacks on the basic human rights. The EU strongly supports your mandate and welcomes your recent report. In your report, you address the topic of psychological torture. Considering the complexities of the topic, a number of views expressed in the report requires further discussion and analysis. The EU supports the conclusions and the importance of continuing to clarify the distinction between permissible, non-coercive investigative techniques and prohibited coercive interrogation as a manner of preventing both physical and psychological torture. Could the Special Rapporteur please elaborate on the occurrence of psychological torture in the context of criminal investigations and police detentions? and what effect the use of investigative interviewing could have in this regard. Thank you for your attention.
I thank you. And now I would like to give the floor to Chile on behalf of a group of countries. You have the floor, please.
Señor Vicepresidente.
Vice President, it's an honor for me to make this statement on behalf of Argentina, Brazil, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Mexico, Paraguay, Uruguay, Peru, and Chile. We'd like to thank the Special Rapporteur for his report. It clearly identifies the goals, effects of psychological torture, and the destructive effect it has on people. It's a valuable analysis when it comes to sanctioning this crime and ensuring rehabilitation and reparation for victims. We'd highlight the importance of criminalizing this, including psychological impact. Our region has been a pioneer in including in the definition of torture in Article 2 of the American Convention to Prevent and Sanction Torture, mental suffering. We share the view of the rapporteur as regards psychological torture, which affects people differently. Gender, age, disability, and other factors may have an impact on the level of harm. We'd highlight the recommendation as regards the need to have prepared technical personnel in the area of the medical, judicial, and police staff to address the victims of psychological torture and their needs, and taking a holistic approach. We also take note of the rapporteur's suggestion as regards new technologies which could be used for psychological torture purposes. It would be useful if you give us some example of this phenomenon. Finally, our countries would like to restate our commitment to your mandate in the eradication and prevention of the practice of torture, be it physical or psychological, globally. Thank you.
I thank you. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Czech Republic. Please.
Mr. Vice President, the Czech Republic aligns itself with the EU statement. We thank the Special Rapporteur on Torture for his report. We welcome the information on his 2 country visits to the Comoros and Maldives, and we appreciate the cooperation provided by Maldives. Mr. Special Rapporteur, can you share with us your plans for future visits? What is the level of cooperation by countries you intend to visit? In our view, the country visits belong to the core activities of special procedures, and we invite all states, in particular members of this Council, to extend the standing invitation to all special procedures. The Czech Republic fully respects and supports the universal prohibition of torture and its non-derogable character. Together with the Special Rapporteur, we see no difference between the physical and psychological forms of torture. There are no light forms of torture. We invite the Subcommittee on the Prevention of Torture to make use of the presented report. We would be interested to know whether the Subcommittee has also had an opportunity to reflect on the psychological forms of torture during its regular visits in the OPCAT state parties. I thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'll give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan. Please.
Mr. Vice President, Pakistan thanks the Rapporteur for his comprehensive presentation. We welcome the report's thematic focus on psychological torture, which adversely affects the victims in the long run. The systematic use of psychological torture as a tool of oppression against people fighting for their inalienable right to self-determination constitutes a grave and multiplier human rights violation. Every form of cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment, including torture, has been employed by India in occupied Jammu and Kashmir for decades. Since 5th August last year, it has only intensified, and this has been documented by UN human rights machinery, international media and human rights organizations. Subjected to a collective form of punishment for over 200 days in an open-air cage, the Kashmiri people are facing the worst form of torture and ill-treatment in modern history. Reportedly, torture is savagely carried out by Indian occupying forces with loudspeakers so that the surrounding community can listen to the victims screaming, who are often resuscitated using electric shocks. BBC last year reported of instances where torture victims in occupied Kashmir were heard pleading to Indian security personnel, "Kill us, but do not beat us." The renowned medical journal Lancet in its editorial has rightfully raised serious concern about the mental health crisis in occupied Kashmir due to protected exposure of Kashmiri people to violence. We would encourage the Special Rapporteur to press India to halt use of all forms of torture, including psychological torture, as a tool of oppression in occupied Kashmir. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to distinguished representative of Brazil. You have the floor.
Thank you. Brazil would like to thank the Special Rapporteur for his report examining questions of psychological torture under human rights law. This report provides balanced and insightful contribution regarding the matter, not only in a conceptual and interpretative perspective, but also in practical ways, as it suggests tools to identify these types of violations. Brazil is committed to fighting torture through its comprehensive national system for preventing and combating torture established in 2013. Brazil's anti-domestic violence law, the known Law Maria da Penha, provides for the condemnation of psychological violence. It defines domestic and family violence against women as any action or omission that causes a woman's death, injury, psychological, sexual, or physical suffering. It considers psychological violence as any behavior that causes emotional damage and reduction of self-esteem, that harms and disturbs full development, that aims at degrading or controlling a woman's actions, behaviors, beliefs, and decisions. This violence can take place by means such as threat, embarrassment, humiliation, constant surveillance, among others, that damage to the woman's psychological health. Brazil would appreciate if the rapporteur could elaborate more on the relation between psychological violence and psychological torture, as well as on how this Council can contribute to the adequate implementation of the prohibition.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, time is up. Next speaker is State of Palestine. You have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, and I would also like to thank the Special Rapporteur for his comprehensive and detailed report. Mr. Vice President, in light of this report, we condemn all forms of torture and cruel and inhumane degrading treatment inflicted on individuals. Torture under any circumstance cannot be justified. We would also like to remind the Council that using torture is prohibited under customary international law, meaning all members of the international community are bound to the prohibitions. Despite it being non-derogable, Israel continues to practice all forms of torture on Palestinians, specifically towards Palestinian prisoners, as a tool to obtain confessions during investigations. Sleep deprivation, blindfolding, position torture, and demolition of the houses of the detainees and threatening the livelihood of their families are some of the many forms of torture inflicted on prisoners and their families. In addition, Palestinians in Gaza continue to suffer from psychological torture due to severe trauma caused by the unlivable humanitarian conditions that are inflicted upon the people due to the Israeli illegal blockade and the constant threat of Israeli aggression. The deprivation of liberty and the feeling of powerlessness continues to cause mental and psychological pain on Palestinians living in Gaza, more importantly on women and children. Mr. Vice President, our question to the Special Rapporteur is what measures can be taken to ensure the adequate implementation of the prohibition of torture in all its forms and to safeguard the human rights of every individual. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba. Please.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. We'd like to thank the Special Rapporteur for the report. We've taken due note of this report, particularly the issue of psychological torture. This is doubtless a complex issue. It's very topical and significant issue given international circumstances. We believe that these issues need to be analysed not only within states and in the light of their national obligations, but in a broader framework, including the historic behaviour of some states in the international arena, particularly the use of advanced methods of psychological warfare and their impact on individual and collective human rights, and this as part of geopolitical agendas of domination. It's also worth exploring further the impact of technological advance in this area, particularly information and communication technologies, as is correctly flagged up in paragraph 87 of the report. President, we restate our commitment to our international obligations in this area. The Constitution of our Republic, approved last year with a massive popular referendum, expressly prohibits torture and cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment. This year, Cuba will be reporting for the third time to the Committee Against Torture. This will be an excellent opportunity to continue perfecting how we promote and protect the rights, all human rights in our country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to distinguished representative of Switzerland, please.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Vice President. Switzerland would like to thank the Special Rapporteur on his report, which explores the issue of psychological torture. It underlines an important aspect and contributes by so doing to a better understanding of the definition of torture. Special Rapporteur, what reflections in your report do you believe need to be particularly focused on? Switzerland appreciates the reference to the expert work ongoing as regards international guidelines on questions and interviews and associated guarantees. Such guidelines can provide an important contribution to the effectiveness of interviews and questionings within the criminal justice system in line with human rights. Finally, the resolution on renewing the mandate of the Special Rapporteur will also be negotiated during this session. As regards the very worrying situation reigning in many parts of the world, be it in the migration context or armed conflicts or in the fight against terrorism, the Special Rapporteur is called upon to act on many fronts. Special Rapporteur, given the renewal of your mandate, I'd like to know what particular challenges do you wish to focus on in the future? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I will give the floor to the distinguished representative of Liechtenstein, please. I think absent, so next speaker is Afghanistan. You have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Afghanistan welcomes the report of the Special Rapporteur on torture and appreciates the insight and recommendations presented in the report. As a party to the Convention Against Torture and the Optional Protocol, Afghanistan recognizes the absolute prohibition of both physical and mental torture as being contrary to the inherent dignity of the human person. To this end, we have strengthened our legal and institutional frameworks, working to bring them in line with international standards. Mr. Vice President, the Constitution of Afghanistan prohibits the abominable practice of torture in all its forms. The new Penal Code of Afghanistan broadly addresses torture while specifically prohibiting the use of inappropriate language, insults, and anticipated punishment. Afghanistan has also begun implementation of its National Action Plan to Elimination of Torture. In 2018, the Law of Prevention of Torture entered into force, creating, among other things, the Commission for the Prevention of Torture. This commission both monitors and oversees the detention center and is led by the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission. Collectively, these efforts have resulted in overall reduction of credible torture and ill treatment allegations by conflict-related detainees. Afghanistan remains committed to eliminating torture in all its forms and offers our support to the work of Special Rapporteur. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to distinguished representative of Iraq, please.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. تؤكد حكومة بلادي حرصها على.
Thank you. My government would like to restate its attachment to protecting human dignity and to end torture in all forms and manifestations. I'd like to say that our law enforcement agencies are in line with the necessary standards. Our Iraqi institutions take very seriously any complaint of torture and take all measures against perpetrators who carry out acts of torture, and they are taken to the justice system. As regards the report itself, Iraqi laws prohibit all forms of torture or anything which causes physical or psychological suffering, and also prohibits extraction of confessions using force. We also try to accommodate basic psychological protection. We try to end bullying, rumors, harassment, ensure that people don't usurp identities, as well as take it very seriously forced disappearances. Finally, Iraq has a question for the rapporteur. What about the recommendations made to... Sorry, the President interrupts.
شكرا سيد نائب الرئيس. اطلع وفد بلادي باهتمام على تقرير المقرر.
Thank you. We've taken due note of the Special Rapporteur's report on torture. We'd like to thank you, sir, for your presentation. We agree with you when it comes to the seriousness of violations of human rights, particularly the use of psychological torture. I think there needs to be a definition of this phenomenon in national legislations. We would like to point out that our national legislation reaffirms the gravity of psychological torture in line with international norms. We draw no distinction between physical suffering and psychological suffering. When we qualify something as a crime, we take into account also the psychological suffering. And in fact, psychological suffering can be even broader, and it is something which can add to the severity of the crime. We have also a prevention system and a protection system against torture which has really developed. We have our National Human Rights Institution and a Commissioner for the Rights of Detainees, amongst others. We have a special unit also that has been created to investigate into allegations of torture. By way of conclusion, we are ready to cooperate with all human rights mechanisms, council mechanisms, as well as the special rapporteurs and also the mandate holders in order to promote human rights.
I now give the floor to distinguished representative of Philippines.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Philippines thanks the Special Rapporteur for his report. The Philippines 2009 Anti-Torture Act defines psychological torture as referring to acts committed by a person in authority which are calculated to affect or confuse the mind and or undermine a person's dignity and morale. Penalties are imposed on those who commit any act of mental or psychological torture. The laws implementing rules establish and provide mechanisms for the participation of the health sector and provide standards for the provision of health, including psychological services. The Philippine Bureau of Jail Management and Penology has a revised policy on mandatory reporting of torture cases and a comprehensive rehabilitation program for torture victims and their families. The Philippine National Police Human Rights Affairs Office has likewise spearheaded seminars for police officers, paralegal officers, jail nurses, social workers, and welfare development officers on torture screening, documentation, reporting, rehabilitation, prevention, and promotion of humane treatment of persons deprived of liberty. The Special Rapporteur referred in his report to cyber torture as an emerging area of concern, citing how it intersects with online sexual exploitation of children, cyberbullying, cyber surveillance, and the use of medical implants and neurotechnological devices. Could the Special Rapporteur cite examples of efforts to define and qualify cyber torture in national legislation? We assure the Special Rapporteur of our continued support and cooperation with the mandate. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to distinguished representative of France. Please.
Thank you, Vice President. Special Rapporteur, France thanks you for your report, which underlines the specific character of psychological torture as opposed to other forms of torture, and we would like to reassure you of our support. We share your concern on the challenges of emerging technologies. France is a state party to the European Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, and we reaffirm our commitment to combat torture in all its manifestations, particularly those linked to emerging technologies. Special Rapporteur, as regards international cooperation, what practices could you recommend to states so that they can set up programs which can effectively combat psychological torture? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to distinguished representative of Ecuador. Please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. My delegation would like to thank the Special Rapporteur for the reports and also the Voluntary Fund of the United Nations for Victims of Torture and highlight the importance of assistance to victims of torture and members of their families. The death penalty and torture are prohibited in Ecuador since 1906. Something is reflected in the Constitution. Ecuador is party to the Convention Against Torture and its protocol and actively participates in the national mechanism of the prevention of torture and participates from the very beginning in the Global Alliance to put an end to the trade in goods that are used for the death penalty and ill treatment. Ecuador has been having close cooperation with all mandate holders through different communications and the 6 visits that we received over the last 2 years. And we received full support and provided full support to the rapporteurs in conditions of independence. Ecuador stresses the need that all mandate holders, without any exceptions, observe the rules for their operations on the basis of principles of impartiality and objectivity with non-politizations, on the basis of the code of conduct, and also to ensure that they use their capabilities to ensure the protection of all human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to distinguished representative of Malaysia. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Malaysia takes note of the Special Rapporteur's report, which focuses on the overarching theme of psychological torture. Malaysia does not condone any form of torture or ill treatment against any individual. As an example, evidence gathered through torture or ill treatment is prohibited under Malaysian laws. In cases where there are substantial evidences of mistreatment or abuse, perpetrators will be persecuted in accordance with relevant Malaysian laws. Moving on to the theme of our discussion today, we have identified useful elements in the Special Rapporteur's report in enhancing normative, institutional, and policy frameworks in relation to prohibition of torture and ill treatment. Appropriate advocacy tools are important. States must also be given adequate support, technical assistance, flexibility, and also sufficient time to develop national mechanisms. Relevant remedies must be in place to support victims of torture, and states must be supported in strengthening of accountability and remedy mechanisms. In this context, Malaysia welcomes international efforts for rehabilitation of victims of torture through the United Nations Voluntary Fund for Victims of Torture. We would be pleased to learn from the Special Rapporteur on how states can develop a holistic approach in enhancing normative, institutional, and policy frameworks towards elimination of torture in law and practice. Also, we are keen to learn from the Special Rapporteur on how cyber torture can be adequately addressed given the anonymity of the perpetrators. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Tunisia. Please, you have the floor.
شكرا سيد نائب الرئيس. نرحب بالمقرر الخاص وندعم ولايته ونشكره على تقريره وما تضمنه من توصيات.
I'd like to thank the Special Rapporteur for his report, and we take note of what was said about psychological pressure. This is a phenomenon that is quite widespread because this is a very harmful practice, and this creates situations where sometimes psychological torture is more accepted than physical torture. And official bodies and civil society should condemn this phenomenon. Also, we should recognize victims of psychological torture because these are indeed victims of torture. We should facilitate their rehabilitation and reinsertion in societies. Mr. Vice President, cooperation and partnership with all stakeholders and all organizations dealing with combating torture is a necessary prerequisite to put an end to psychological torture, to eliminate torture. Finally, can the Special Rapporteur give us his opinion about the effects of physical torture, whether they actually include psychological pressure or this has a special legal nature?
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Fiji.
Fiji extends its appreciation to the Special Rapporteur for his report. Over the years, Fiji has ratified the Convention Against Torture, implemented proper safeguards in our criminal justice system, and ensured that violations are prosecuted with those responsible held accountable. We recently joined the CTI core group and are extremely proud of the work of CTI. We take this opportunity to also commend Angola, Grenada, Kiribati, and Samoa for its recent ratification of UNCET last year. Mr. Vice President, the substantive concept of torture stipulated under Article 1 of UNCET comprises of international and purposeful infliction of severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental. In comparison, Fiji's constitution explicitly provides an added element to the definition of torture and comprises of physical, mental, or emotional. The focus of the current report on psychological torture is extremely appreciated. It brings greater attention to the seriousness of psychological torture. It also proposes working definition of psychological and physical torture from the perspective of international human rights law. Mr. Vice President, the current report provide states with an opportunity to be better informed to recognize whether its current practice tends to deny, neglect, misinterpret, or trivialize psychological torture. We hope that all states properly digest this report, and it is an opportunity not to be missed. I thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Morocco.
Merci, Monsieur le Vice-Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. My delegation would like to thank Mr. Meltzer, Special Rapporteur on Torture, for the presentation of his report that reviews conceptual issues and also definitions and interpretations related to the notion of psychological torture in connection with human rights. The Kingdom of Morocco is pleased with the positive interaction that we have with mandate holders, but it is important not only to fight the practice of torture, but also prevent torture by studying all of the aspects of torture. Morocco is fully committed to the combat against torture and preventing torture, and has taken on board the new definitions and recommendations that you have presented in your report in order to enrich our legal practice. Finally, I would like to wish you full success in your fight against torture. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Denmark.
Mr. Vice President, Denmark aligns itself with the statement of the EU. We strongly support the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on torture. Torture is a grave violation of human rights and human dignity. The fight against torture is therefore one of the main priorities for our membership of the Council. During this session, we are also pleased to present a draft resolution renewing the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on torture. Mr. Meltzer, we welcome your report on psychological torture. This is both a relevant and complex topic. Psychological torture can indeed occur in a variety of contexts, including criminal investigations and police detentions. We therefore welcome your call for support to the ongoing process to develop international guidelines on investigative interviewing. As we continue our work, we find that some of your findings could benefit from further examination. For instance, the question on attribution. You describe a variety of acts that could amount to torture, including in situations where the involvement of public officials is not apparent. Could you elaborate on that question of attribution? Thank you.
Thank you. This was the last speaker that we could accommodate at this meeting. Now I would like to invite Mr. Meltzer to respond to the questions and comments made at this stage. Mr. Meltzer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And thank you very much to the distinguished representatives for all their comments and questions and their expressions of support, both for the mandate generally and for the topic addressed in this specific report. I think when we're discussing psychological torture, it is important to distinguish three things. We have to distinguish the psychological consequences of each instance of torture. Every act of torture has psychological consequences. So when we're discussing psychological torture, it's not really the consequences necessarily we're focusing on, but the methods, because, as I said, consequences, you have always psychological and physical consequences of torture, of any act of whether it's physical or psychological. The aim of torture is always to coerce, intimidate, coerce a confession or punish, so it always has a mental effect that is intended. So again, the aim of any act of torture, whether physical or mental, has a psychological component. So when we're really distinguishing psychological torture, we're talking about the method, which is the avenue that is being used to achieve the coercion. Is it the physical pain and suffering, or is it the psychological mental pain and suffering? So that's the first thing. The second thing I'd like to clarify also is that in reality, obviously, torture victims are almost always exposed to a combination of techniques and circumstances that inflict both mental and physical pain and suffering. So there is not, it would be artificial to think there is psychological torture exists in isolation, but it's important to understand it as a concept so courts and government officials, law enforcement officials can identify these techniques as being and amounting to torture, even though they may not cause physical pain or suffering. So I think that this is really the definition that we should give to psychological torture in that context. If I want to just specify it a bit more clearly, is that it includes all methods, techniques and circumstances which intend or are designed to purposefully inflict severe mental pain or suffering without using the conduit or the effect of physical pain or suffering. In contrast to physical torture, which uses the body and its physiological needs as a conduit for affecting the victim's mind and emotions, psychological torture does so by directly targeting one or several basic psychological needs. And these needs can be identified as, for example, the need for security, and it's being affected through threats, intimidation, the use of phobia, inducing anxieties, or the need of self-control and self-determination, which is affected by domination and submission, and basically stripping the person of its ability to control aspects of its life. The person's need of dignity, which is obviously affected by humiliation and breach of privacy, as breach of sexual integrity, but also the need of environmental orientation, which is affected by deprivation of sensory manipulation and sensory deprivation, the need for social and emotional rapport, which is affected by isolation and exclusion, emotional manipulation, and finally the need for communal trust, that they can rely on an environment which is affected by this constant arbitrariness of the environment. So I think it's important to understand these cumulative elements, although they individually will not amount to torture when taken in isolation. Cumulatively they have this effect. Would you like me to respond to the individual questions now or after? Okay. So I conclude with this general remark, and I will go answer to your specific questions after the next segment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. We will reconvene at 3 p.m. today to continue this interactive dialogue, followed by the interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I hereby close the 12th meeting of the 43rd session of the Human Rights Council.